Hello everybody, Chris here, and today I want to take you through the steps of editing a video from beginning to completion inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. So hopefully we're going to be able to do this in 30 minutes or less. I plan to show you most of the basics, so I'm going to be glossing over the more advanced tabs, which would consist of Fusion, Color, and Fairlight. And instead we're going to be mostly focused on the Media tab, the Cut tab, the Edit tab, and then at the end for exporting your video, the Deliver tab. So to get started, we want to import video clips into our project, and the ideal tab to do that on is the Media tab over on the far left. So when you click on the Media tab, you can see the Media Storage section in the top left-hand corner. If you ever don't see one of these windows that I'm talking about, you can probably open it up by clicking on the name of it on the top bar. So with the Media Storage tab, we want to add in locations on our computer where we are storing media clips. By default, a few folders such as your user account video folders. By default, a few directories such as your user account /videos will be auto-included here. But if you don't see it on this list, then we can add in a new location on your computer or network by right-clicking and doing Add New Location. Now I want to pull in files from this 30 minutes folder I created earlier, but if I go ahead and select folder here, what we'll see happen is that it will say that a higher level directory already exists in the list. So if you run across that, what that means is that on your list of locations, there's already one that's higher level than that. So my desktop here, we can see Chris User's desktop, contains the 30 minutes folder. So instead of adding it to the list here, I need to start by clicking on the User's Chris desktop and then navigate into the subdirectories such as the 30 minutes folder. So here we have a few video clips. If we want to preview any of them, we can left click and it will pop over here on the video preview window. If you hover over a clip, you'll get a line that will indicate the position in the whole video clip that you're looking at, and you can scrub it to get immediate thumbnails of the video footage you're looking at. So that will help you identify which clips you actually mean to bring into your project and which ones are unnecessary, especially if you're working with a lot of videos. Now note that this is in the thumbnail view here. There's also the list view, which looks like this. So you can't see the image thumbnails of each of the videos. You can still click on them to open them up and scrub through the clip on the preview window over here. But the main advantage of the list view is that obviously you can squeeze a lot more videos onto the list, and then you can see more technical information about those items. By the way, if you want to expand a window, just go to the edge of one of your windows and left click, and then you should usually be able to scrub and expand one window by shrinking another. So to bring these video files into our project, I want them to end up in this clip pool down here. So I'm simply going to take these 3 video clips and drag them in their full entirety into the media pool. And depending on your project settings, there's a good chance that you'll get this pop-up which says that the clips have a different frame rate than the current project settings. So when you're creating your video, you're probably going to be aiming for a certain frame rate that you want the final video to export in. For YouTube, that's commonly going to be 30 or 60 FPS. So it's up to you if you want to change the timeline frame rate to match whatever the video is. In this case, I'm going to hit Don't Change. But if you want to see what the base frame rate on these videos is, a good way to do that is to open up the list view, expand it, and look for the FPS category. So you can see that these video clips are 30 FPS, 29.97 FPS, and 29.97 FPS as well. If you want to know what your settings for your current project are, then you want to go up to the File menu, do Project Settings, and you'll be able to see your timeline resolution and the timeline frame rate. Now note that while you have any clips in the media pool, you can no longer change the timeline frame rate. So if you do ever want to change this so that in your timeline, the videos play back at a different frames per second amount, then we can remove these from the media pool by left click and dragging a box around them, hitting the delete key and removing them from our media pool. And now that the media pool is clear, we can actually change that timeline frame rate to whatever we want, whether that's 30 FPS, 60 FPS, or some other setting. So for now, I'm going to add these video clips back in. Once again, I'm going to hit Don't Change because I want to leave the final timeline resolution at 30 FPS. And now to start editing our video, we can go over to the Cut tab or the Edit tab. So we'll start with the Cut tab because that's specifically new to DaVinci Resolve 16. So the Cut tab is basically a simplified version of the Edit tab where it presents less windows to you on screen, has a little bit less features in what you're able to do in the Cut tab, but it's more optimized for if you're working on one screen or if all you're trying to do is make a bunch of cuts to get your video out the door, and you don't really need to worry too much about advanced settings such as doing keyframe animation. So just to take a quick look at the Edit tab, one of the main things that is missing from the Cut tab is the inspector here. So in order to see some of the settings that pop open in the inspector, if I drop a clip onto the timeline like this and I left click on it, you can see that there's a lot of settings you can edit about a video clip inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. Now some of these still exist on the Edit tab, but as I mentioned before, you can't click on these little diamonds in order to animate a property such as zoom over time. And so once again, the main difference is that on the Edit tab, you have more full control over everything in your video clips, the changes and adjustments that you want to make to those. The interface can get a little bit cluttered, so you may actually prefer to do some basic editing in the Cut tab instead. Another one of the key differences between the Inspector tab and now jumping back over to the Cut tab is that on the Edit tab, you actually only have one timeline that you're working with here. So if you want to make any changes, you're going to need to scrub throughout the timeline and navigate with your timeline cursor to get where you want to make your edits. But on the Cut tab, you have not one but 3 timelines that actually exist to you, 2 that you can see on the screen. So the bottom timeline works differently than in the Edit tab as well, because this timeline is always going to be centered no matter what on whatever your position is in the video. And then the second timeline right above it will always show the entire video project. So whether your timeline is 18 seconds long or an hour long, you'll always be able to see all of the clips on this timeline. The third timeline, which is for making frame-by-frame edits, shows up when you're trying to make adjustments to the edges of one of your clips. So let's start by dragging a second clip into the timeline, and I'll put it on this main project timeline that shows everything. So I'm going to drag this right above the video track 1, which will create the video track 2 immediately. You can see it numbered over here, video track 2, video track 1. Main thing to note, if you don't already know, is that whatever is on the top video track is always going to show over whatever is on lower tracks. If I go to this part where the second video clip comes in, you can see that as soon as the second clip is there, we can no longer see the bottom video. Now, in most cases for the base video, we'd want that to not be layered on top of each other, but to be side by side. So with this clip on the top video track, I can left click and drag that down here to the video track 1. And you can see that in the Cut tab, you don't have to be exactly precise about things. There's a little bit of smart sensing about what you're trying to do inside of the Cut tab of DaVinci Resolve 16. So it'll kind of auto snap there to the right side of the first clip. Now both clips are on video track 1. And in order to see the third timeline, I could do something like left click on the border between these 2 clips. So now you can see 2 preview windows over here in clip edit mode. This is another one of the differences. It'll show the ending frame of the left-hand clip and the starting frame of the right-hand clip. So what dragging on the border between 2 clips normally does is pulls in more or less of the source material, but because the source material is already fully in the timeline, we'd actually have to decrease part of it. So one way I could remove some of the source material from the timeline would be to hit Control B to make a blade slice, and then that'll separate one clip into 2, and I can hit delete in order to remove that part. Another would be that rather than clicking on the border between 2 video clips, you can click on the right side and drag it in. So this is basically removing part of the start of the clip by a few seconds there. And now you'll see that when we left click on the border between those clips, we actually get green instead of red. So the green represents that there's extra source material to pull from in making our adjustments. So now if we left click, we can actually drag to the left and right, and you'll notice that those 2 previews at the top there are immediately updated in real time. So we can see what the new starting frame and ending frame is going to be between these 2 video clips. And if we want even more control, that's where the third timeline comes into play, because you can see that this timeline works on a frame-by-frame change. So you can see how it will start saying +1 or -1 or -2 frames. So we're doing frame-by-frame adjustments, which will allow you to get exactly the right starting point and ending point that you're looking for. And once you find that spot, you can just kind of let go, and then you'll have made your change to both clips simultaneously by controlling the starting and ending point. So at this point, I might want to go to the start of this video clip and adjust or trim the start of this video. So I can drag this in to basically pick the frame where we want the video to start at. So we could do it here, where in the background that guy kind of is holding his chin a little bit, and let go, and our change has been made. So let's show a couple more quick adjustments you can make inside of the Cut tab. If you want to add in a video transition, go to the part of the timeline where you have an edge of a clip, such as the start of your video. And then over here in the media pool, you'll notice that there's an option here for dissolve. So that's referring to a dissolve transition, which is probably about as simple as you can get. And if we click on that with a simple left click, you'll see that the dissolve transition is immediately added on here to our video clip. You can see over here in the preview window, it's a cross dissolve. If we hit the spacebar or the play button, we can actually see how that looks. So let's play that back one more time. And you can see that in this case, because it's dissolving from black, it simply fades the video in. But if we go in between two video clips, such as that cut we had earlier, we can click dissolve again, and that'll create a quick transition between these two video clips. So this will have it fade from one clip into the other clip in a very smooth transition. And of course we can go to the end of the video and have a fade out by clicking dissolve one more time and having the video fade out at the end of the video. So that's just a really easy way you can add in transitions to your video clips. So one more thing about the Cut tab, if we open up this tools window, you can see that under the preview, then you'll get a bunch of options that you can actually control about your video clip. So you'll be able to see the video clip that you're working on in your main project timeline here. So left click on it to be sure about which one you're editing. And then we can change something like the zoom here by changing the value here from 1 to 2, which is going to massively zoom in our video shot. And we can hit play to see how that looks with that change made. Note that it only affects the video clip we're working on and not the entire project. So I'm going to undo that for now, but note that there's other settings you can change very similarly to the inspector in the edit tab, which we'll get to in a second here, such as position X, position Y. If we go over to the other tabs, you have cropping the edges of a window. So if you want to remove part of the left side or the top or the bottom or the right, you can do that. On the fourth one, you can increase the speed. So if we wanted to make it 1.5 times speed, we can increase that. Note that that may modify your timeline simply because it runs out of source material when it's playing back in a faster speed. But if we go here and hit space here, you can see that the characters are kind of moving a little bit faster than they would in real time. So I'll hit Control Z in order to undo that. Okay, so lastly, before jumping to the edit tab, note that you can add in other types of transitions up here in the top left-hand corner. You would drag these onto the border between two clips in order to change the type of transition. You can also add in titles to your video timeline, and you can add in special effects. So this works mostly the same way as the edit tab, and as such, I'll talk about that more in a minute here. So going now over to the edit tab, we're working more in a full-featured interface that has more stuff going on, and maybe a bit more ideal if you could pick up a second monitor so that you can spread some of these windows out. But in any case, you can see that you have the media pool over here on the top left. That's where all of your clips are going to be. The edit index in the bottom left. In most cases, I find you can just kind of churn that off, but what this will show is all of your most recent edits that you've made to your video, referring to the type of edit, in this case adding cross dissolves or adding clips onto the timeline, and you can see all of those listed chronologically. I don't need that, so I'm going to actually turn off the edit index. You also have the effects library. As I was just talking about with the Cut tab, you have transitions, titles, and effects. Now those are listed as separate windows on the Cut tab, but on the Edit tab, they're all in this effects library toolbox. So if you want video transitions, you click on the video transitions menu. There's also audio transitions, which refers to crossfade, so that will have audio from one clip fade out as another clip fades in, or if you put it at the start of your video, as in the first video clip or the last video clip, then you can just have it fade from nothing or fade out to nothing in kind of the same way as a video dissolve, just with the audio levels instead. And then in the titles menu, you have many preset titles. So you might notice that these are called Fusion titles. So Fusion titles are 3D compositions that are set up in the Fusion tab. We won't really get into that too much in this video, but you can create 3D compositions inside of DaVinci Resolve, which can be things like particle effects, titles, creating 3D shapes, or putting an image on a plane. But that's a bit complicated for right now, so if you're interested in that, check out some of my other videos specifically on Fusion nodes. You can also go to the effects menu here for adding in an adjustment clip or a fusion composition. So a fusion composition would be where you want to create a completely new Fusion 3D composition from scratch. That would be the starting block for that. And there's also adjustment clips. So if you have multiple clips and you want to change all of them at the same time for a period of time, then you can put an adjustment clip on top of that and do something like zoom ×2. And as long as the clips are underneath that for that period of time, all of those clips will receive the zoom ×2. In addition to transitions and titles, you also have some other options you can create, such as blank fusion compositions when you want to create like a 3D title but completely from scratch. You have open effects filters, which will change your video, but aren't meant to actually transition from one video scene into another one. So for instance, Resolve Effects blurs. If you want to blur out a video clip for the entire duration, then you can simply drag something like a Gaussian blur onto your video clip. And you'll see that that immediately changes how that video clip looks. Without going into too much detail, once you've added an open effects to a video clip, you can open up the inspector in the top right, and that will show up under the open effects category, and there'll be settings you can change about that. But for right now, I'll just go ahead and delete that. There's also audio effects here, some of which are built in, which you can drag onto a audio track in order to modify things about that track, such as having noise reduction to remove some of the background noise. If I scroll down here, you probably won't see VST effects, but you can note that you can add external plugins in the form of VST plugins to your computer, which DaVinci Resolve can use, such as Reaper plugins, which can add some extra filters, equalizers, compression tools, things like that, that you can, for the most part, get from the default Fairlight effects, but the external plugins usually work a little bit differently, and you may find you get better results there. Okay, so enough about all of that. When you're working in your timeline and you start adding a bunch of clips, you probably find that you want to increase or decrease the zoom for your timeline. So there is an option here right above the timeline where you can control the zoom, and you can see your video clips in a bunch more detail. So anywhere there is a little white box over the edges of one of our video or audio tracks, that is actually a video or audio transition. So we added these over in the Cut tab, but if you click on them, you can actually see that you can modify some of the settings about them over in the inspector, just like you can click on a clip in order to modify settings in more detail, just like you can left click on a video clip in order to modify more settings than you would have been able to do otherwise on the Cut tab. So for instance, if we zoom in here and we left click on the cross dissolve, we can add an ease curve with the ease drop down menu and change that to in and out. And what that will make happen is that the transition starts slow and ends slow, but goes fastest in the middle, which will make it look like this, rather than no easing, which will have a consistent speed animation. So that would probably be easier to tell if we actually increase the duration of this effect. So you can left click on the border of a transition and drag it to increase the duration. So I'll drag it over here where it adds 1 second to it. You can also, in the inspector, change that manually by typing in a duration up here. So let's play that back one more time. And you may be able to tell there that the fastest point is in the center. So now I'll set it to ease curve none, and you'll see that it's a consistent speed effect. Using the inspector, you can make all kinds of changes over time like that. So let's go ahead and show some new stuff. I'm going to add in a third clip by dragging from my media pool onto the video timeline here and have it snap into place right next to that other clip. If you don't see it snap, then you may not have snapping enabled. So snapping is an option you can click on right here. You'll know it's enabled when it is white instead of grayed out. So on the Edit tab, there's different modes for editing video clips in the timeline. So by default, you have the selection mode, which will give you the basic operating system cursor, and that'll let you drag around clips to whatever timelines you need them on. Note that if you need a third timeline, you can just keep dragging up and the third timeline will be automatically created, as well as fourth and so on. There's also trim mode. So trim edit mode works most similar to how things do on the Cut tab, where if you go over to the edge of a video clip, you can see that you can trim the start and end of your clip by left clicking and dragging on the side of the start or end of the clip. You can also adjust which part of the source material is going to be contained in this video clip without changing the duration in the timeline by left clicking in the thumbnail area and dragging to the left and right. you'll notice that as long as there's extra source material, it'll kind of give you this ghost white outline, showing how much data there is to keep dragging to pull from the source material. When you get to the edge of the source material, it'll give you that red line on the edge showing that there's nothing left to pull from. So you can make adjustments as long as there is source material. Now, if you want to make cuts without hitting Control-B every time, although Control-B works pretty nicely as a hotkey, as you can see there, you can also do it with the mouse if you click on Blade Edit Mode or you hit B on your keyboard. So this will change your cursor into a razor blade. You can left-click anywhere you want in order to cut one clip into two clips. So by doing that, you can now manipulate these clips as their own individual pieces. So if I just want to take this part of the source material that I've cut into its own separate clips, and I want to zoom in on it, I can just go over to the inspector with that new clip selected, zoom and set it to ×2. And you'll notice that that has no effect on any of the other clips, even if they were pulled from the same source material. Okay, so now to show something new and a bit more interesting, keyframe animation is a pretty big part of DaVinci Resolve. So if you want the zoom to increase or decrease over time, what we can do is set keyframes and have DaVinci Resolve animate between those keyframes automatically by having the software figure out how much zoom it should be at every frame of video. So if I go to the start of this clip where I want to zoom in, and I click on this little white diamond next to the property I want to animate, such as the zoom, then that will set a keyframe. So this will mean that at that point in time, the first frame of this clip, it's going to be 1.0 zoom. So that's just the normal video, not zoomed in any more than it normally is. Now I go to a new part in the timeline by dragging the timeline cursor, and if I want to set a new keyframe, I simply need to change the value now to what it should be at that point in time. So if I set 1.5 and hit enter, you can see that the second keyframe is automatically created. If I go back to the first frame, you can see that there it's still 1.0. And if I go forward in video, you can see that the value now changes automatically over time. Now, if you want to quickly navigate between keyframes, as long as there's more than one keyframe, you can left click on these arrows that will be created in order to jump to the next and previous keyframes on your video clip. And that's very, very convenient. If we zoom in a bit more on the timeline, so I'm going to use the timeline bar for this, and we go to our video clip. On the bottom right, you'll see two options that are related to keyframing. If we click on this one, the one that looks like the keyframing diamond, we can see the keyframes for each property in the timeline. And if we drag the timeline cursor, it will automatically snap to those keyframes where we can make adjustments easily. We can also drag the keyframes across time if we want the starting and ending points for those animations to be closer together or further away, thus increasing or decreasing the length of an animation. We can also click on the Ease Curves button over here, which is right to the left there. And then if you want to have easing in and out for any animation, we can click on a keyframe point here. So in order to add easing between these 2 points, I'm going to click on this option over here, the second from the left, which will add in a Bezier curve handle, which we can use to control the curve between the first and second keyframes, but I'm actually going to leave that as defaults there. And in this curve editor, we can edit the value at each keyframe. So we could change the zoom to be 2.0 here, or 3.0 if we wanted to. We can click on the Bezier curve handle in order to adjust the rate of change over time of the animation between these 2 points. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to undo and leave it at its defaults. And of course, we could change the starting value because that's just another keyframe point that we can adjust. Likewise, with the simpler keyframe editor over there to the right, we can drag these points in terms of their duration or starting and end times as well by dragging it to the left and right. So for now, just to show how we were able to animate a property over time, I'm going to hit space here and play back the video. You'll notice that it zooms in over a period of time rather than jumping to its full zoomed in value immediately. So if we keep playing that back, you can notice over in the inspector that the value animates over time without us doing any more work whatsoever. And what's great about keyframe animation is you can use it on many, many different things. So you could animate the position of a video as well. So for instance, you can have a video clip start way off center, like so, and then I can have that animate back to the centered position of 0 over time, just by setting up a couple keyframes, setting the values at those keyframes. And now if I hit space here, you can see that the position also animates over time, in addition to the zoom also animating. So you can get pretty fancy and complicated with that really quickly if you're interested in that. Okay, so at this point, let's show off one more video transition and add a title to our sequence. So what I'll do here is I'll move some of my clips around in another way. Rather than just left-clicking and dragging them where I want them, I'm going to hit Control X to cut the video clip I want, and I'm going to go to where I want it to be and hit Control V to paste it in. Notice how it pops into the timeline. We did leave a gap in between our earlier clips. So one way we can get rid of that gap, and you can also use this to delete a video clip while pushing everything to the right over to the left, is to right-click it and do a ripple delete. So when I do that, you see that the rest of the timeline moves over to the left immediately. If I do that with a video clip, it will remove the video clip while pushing every other video clip to the right over to the left. So if I right-click this and do ripple delete, it pushes everything over to the left. So that is really, really handy when you're editing your videos. You can also do it by hitting delete on your keyboard if you'd rather use hotkeys instead. So like that, just select it with left-click and hit delete. Okay, so now that I have these two different clips, it probably makes sense to have a video transition between them. So in the toolbox, I'm going to choose video transitions. You can see the cross dissolves, which are added by default. You can see the cross dissolves, which we added in earlier. But we want to grab a different kind of transition. So I'm just going to go down here and maybe grab something silly like a heart shape transition. So I'll left click and I'll drag this over on the edge of where I want the transition to be. So that can be on the edge here between these two video clips. I just drag it on there. And if I hit play, I can have that simple transition play back in our timeline. If I need to make any adjustments to it, I can zoom in a little bit so that it's easier to click on, left click on the transition, increase the duration, or maybe if I want a border for this heart, I can add that on there, change the color, just kind of these simple menu settings that you can do to change your video transitions by a little bit. So now we can play it back and we can see how that changes things a little bit by having that extra color there. And pretty much with all these other transitions, it's kind of the same story. You just drag them on where you want them. You can left click on them, modify the settings. Just like in the cut timeline, by the way, you can actually adjust the length of the duration by left clicking on the border inside of the timeline and dragging it, as you can see here. So you don't necessarily need to use the inspector. And just one real quick last way to quickly add transitions. If you left click on a clip and you look at the top left or top right hand corner of those clips, you'll see a little notch here. So if you want to do a simple fade in or fade out, you can drag these to the left to have it fade out over time. So note that this is always going to be a fade to black. So you're basically getting rid of the opacity of the video. So a real simple transition, you can do it with the audio as well. So this will fade the audio out over time or fade it in, which will make it more quiet as you approach the end of the clip or your soundtrack. We can also do that at the start of a video. We can also remove a video transition by left clicking on it and hitting delete. And now if we wanted to replace that with one of those notch fades, we can drag it out over to the right, and we can drag the one on the left clip over to the left and play it back, and you'll see that it fades to black and then fades in from black. So that's just a really quick way you can add transitions as well. And while we're at it, another way is to right click on the border between two video clips and do something like add a 15 frame cross dissolve, which will give you that simple cross dissolve look we were going for earlier, which usually looks really nice, and that's probably why it's the default transition. Okay, so next let's add in a title real quick. So in the effects library, titles, you have a lot of default options you can choose from, and for beginners, I would probably recommend you just stick to a default Fusion titles template, and then you make small edits to it to fit your project needs, such as changing the title text. So if we want to add a title to our timeline, you simply left click it and drag it in. Make sure it is above your main video tracks because we want title templates to show on top of our video, not to override it or not to completely remove the underlying track. So that'll usually mean putting it on video track 2 or above. So we can kind of scrub through this title and see how it will look when it's fully rendered. Depending on your computer, if you try to play it back in the timeline, because it's a 3D fusion composition, it may not render at full speed the first time. You can note that the pre-rendering bar there above the timeline will show how much of it is already pre-rendered. If it's blue, that means it's rendered. If it's red, that means it isn't. So you can just wait a minute if you want it to be able to play back in full speed. Or if you don't need it to play back in the timeline, you can just wait until your final video export, and when it's exported, it will play back in full speed. Now note that when you go to export your video, regardless of if everything on your timeline is pre-rendered or not, when you do the final render, everything will play back in full speed. So you don't have to worry about that blue bar being there. That's only for your in-editor purposes to be able to view it while you're editing your project. And every time you make a change to the template, it's going to need to pre-render anyway. Just don't worry too much about that unless you need to see it back in full speed while you're editing. Okay, so let's go ahead and change a few settings on this title now. So when you left click on your title, if you have the inspector open in the top right, you can see that most of these default out-of-the-box Fusion titles will expose some settings that you can edit in the inspector. So for instance, if I go over to main text and I expand that, you can see that we can change the main text, which is the actual characters that are showing up inside of that title. We can change the font, which I'll go ahead and change here to something I like more, Babus Noi. You can always install more fonts in your computer if you want more to show up there. And you can change the color of your font. Now, note that because these are 3D titles, that the text itself is a 3D object, and depending on how those 3D scenes are set up, there may be light that shows on the text. So that would be why you have multiple text colors here. So the text face color here is more of the base color. So I can make that a little darker to make it more obvious. And then the specular color is going to be the color where the light is showing on. So in this case, we're making it white, which is basically going to take the base color and brighten it up a lot, emphasizing that those are the parts that are being lit. You can also see that the surrounding 3D box kind of has that same thing going on there with a specular white color, and then the base color for that box is more of a teal. So just like with the text, you can actually edit the box material, the specular color, the base color for that, and all other kinds of things. You can. It looks like they've even exposed some light colors. So there's a lot of options you can change here, but just to keep things simple, usually you would stick to what font you want to use, what do you want to show in the box. So I'll call this tutorial on titles here to show us the text in the box. And maybe the font size as well is something you can play around with. But once you have your settings as you want it, you can hit play in the timeline and see how that looks. Obviously, once it pre-renders a little bit more, you'll get a better idea of how it will look in the final result. So every time you play it back, it should have a little bit more pre-rendered. And that should basically show you how your title is going to look in the final result. So really quickly, I want to show a little bit about the Fusion tab. So we're going to jump over to the Fusion tab with our 3D title selected. And the Fusion tab allows you to create or edit 3D compositions such as the 3D titles. So we can see here that we're editing the title clip, and it has a group here that says 3D title long something or another. If you double click on that, you can see the nodes group for the titles. You can see that it's quite complicated. It's got things like main text and 4 different box shapes, and these all need to merge together before creating a final video output. So just note that in the Fusion tab, you create 3D compositions by combining nodes, linking them together, and then that will be able to generate a 3D output. So that is something you can do in DaVinci Resolve if you get a little bit more into it. Okay, so just really quickly as well with the color tab. The color tab is where you can color grade your video. So you can either try to target areas of your video by qualifying them. You can use 3D power windows so that only a corner or a section of your video will receive any color changes, or you can apply a lookup table to an entire video clip in order to change its look. So the idea here is that there's a lot of tools that you can use for controlling the look of your video and tools for targeting which areas you want to change. But up here in the top left-hand corner, we have lookup tables. So if we want to take a video clip and we want to apply a specific look to it, we can go over to a lookup table, such as film looks, and you can hover over them in order to see how you can drastically change the look of a video just by adding in one of these film looks to it. So as you hover over them, you'll be able to see the clips immediately get updated with how it would look if we applied the lookup table. And of course, there are many lookup tables that you can find online in order to play around with how your video looks. So for instance, I had previously downloaded a pack of 35 free lookup tables. So I can kind of go through these and see how it affects the appearance of my video. So if I was looking for something a little bit more grungy, like a music video kind of look, I could use this one, Chemical 1 at 89, I guess. And if I want to apply it to the current clip, I simply have it selected from this clips window down here, which can be enabled or disabled in the top right. And then right click and do apply to current node. And just by doing that, it changes the look of that video clip. So over in the edit tab, we can see that that has immediately applied a drastic look to how our video looks. We can compare that to the other shots which do not have that lookup table enabled. And that's just a quick example of one of many ways we can edit how our video looks in the color tab. So next up is the Fairlight tab. If we click on that, you'll notice that there's a bunch of audio mixers here because the Fairlight tab is where you generally edit the audio of your video. Notice that in the timeline that there's no reference to video clips here because Fairlight is all about audio. We'll gloss over this tab too, but one cool Fairlight effects that they added in with DaVinci Resolve 16 is the dialogue processor. So we can apply this to any audio clip, which is where people are speaking, to process the dialogue, hence the name, drag that onto the clip, and in one audio effect, you actually be given 6 audio processors that tie together theoretically in order to improve the sound of the people speaking in your video. So you'll have some dials to play around with here. You can try it out, see if the dialogue processor makes your audio sound a little bit better. Note that any of these that you don't want, you can click off at any time in order to disable them. And if you want to see once again how it sounds without the dialogue processor, which turns off all of these as well, you can toggle that on and off as well. Noise reduction is also pretty useful if you're just trying to remove some of the background noise from your recorded video. So one useful thing to note about the Fairlight tab is that by adding in an input device in the mixer here, bottom right, so you can add in your microphones and use that in conjunction with tools like automatic dialogue replacement up here if you want to record in some voice-over narration or character lines. So that brings us to the Deliver tab. So on the Deliver tab, we can export our videos. As you can see here, you can export with default settings for YouTube or Vimeo. If you want to upload directly to those services, you can log into your accounts by going up to DaVinci Resolve Preferences and then choosing Internet Accounts. But aside from that, you can either use these defaults over here, or you can create your own custom settings. So if you want to create custom settings for your project, then you can click on these drop downs and find the settings you like. If you're curious about what I like to use, it's usually either MP4 video files or QuickTime. QuickTime is the .mov format with H.264 video codec for the compression. The resolution and the frame rate is going to depend on whatever you are editing your timeline in and what you want the final output resolution to be. So this is 180p right here, which is really common. 720p, which is 1280 by 720, is also really common. You may want to leave the quality automatically restricted to 10,000 kbs per second, or you can just have it set to automatic if you prefer, which will let DaVinci Resolve figure out what bitrate you want to use for your project. So you can give it a file name up here at the top. So I can call this Learn DaVinci Resolve 16. There's also some lesser used settings over in audio and file that you can play around with. Probably more relevant to most people is, do you want to render the entire timeline out to a file, or do you want to output only part of the timeline? So if you want to render part of the timeline, you can navigate with the cursor, hit I in order to set your starting point, and go over to the ending of your video, or wherever you want it to be, wherever you want the export to end at, and hit O. So in this case, if we render the in-out range, it would only be from here to here. Otherwise, we can change render to entire timeline, which will automatically select everything in our timeline, which is usually what you want. So I can hit add to render queue. If you are going to have multiple timelines in your project, you can do multiple render jobs all at once if you want to save some time and just let your computer render for a while when you're done with one or multiple projects. So I'll go ahead and hit that now, and this will export to the publish location on your computer. By the way, you can change that over here where it says location. So I'm exporting to D drive videos publish. You can browse your location on your computer, and that should be pretty easy to get a custom publish setting. So once your video is done, you can go ahead, find it, open it up, upload it to YouTube, whatever you want to do with it. But that's the general gist of how you edit a video inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. So this was obviously a really condensed video, primarily targeted at beginners, but I hope that if this is your first time taking a look at DaVinci Resolve 16 or future versions, that this has helped you to get a better understanding of the workflow and the application and what you can do with it. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.